Alright, so today our chapter would be movement of substances into and out of cells, which is the sixth chapter of Edexcel biology and the second chapter for O-level biology. So basically in movement of substances we'll be actually covering all those substances and how do those substances move in and out of the membranes through three different processes. Actually there are four, namely diffusion, osmosis, active transport and bulk transport. Bulk transport is basically studied in A levels, but right now in your syllabus, both O levels and Edexcel, we have diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. And all these movements actually occur across the membrane. So we have method of transport, and why do we have this method? Their significance we'll be studying. All cells are actually surrounded by a cell membrane. As we studied in cell structure, animal cells have an outermost layer known as the cell membrane. Whereas in case of plant cells, we know that the outermost cell wall is present and the second outermost layer is actually called the membrane. It is different for animal cells and plant cells, but both of these have cell membrane. Another property of cell membrane is that it is actually partially permeable. Partially permeable meaning that it can only let some of the substances into and out, not all of them. Whereas the cell wall has a property of being fully permeable, which also means that it can let any substances enter the cell and can let all of the substances out of the cell. It has no control over the pathways, over the movement of water molecules, or the movement of ions, substances, enzymes, receptors, or any kind of hormones that are going into and out of the cell, whereas the cell membrane is semi-permeable, or we can say it is partially permeable, as it has control over the ions, which we'll be studying afterwards. For example, in muscle and movement, if the cell only needs potassium ions, it would stop all the other ions from coming in and balance a diffusion gradient into and out of the cell. It would only let potassium ions inside and sodium ions outside, so we can have a balanced gradient and the process can go on. Hence, the cell membrane holds a really vital role in controlling the chemical reactions of the cell and maintaining the concentration gradient inside the cells and outside the cells. Here you can see that outside the cell we have water and salt, and they move through this layer which is called the cell membrane, and this is also known as the semi-permeable or partially cell membrane. Molecules can move in and out of the cell by diffusion or active transport. Water can move in and out of the cell by osmosis. So we have two methods for two molecules. When we talk about molecules, they move by two processes. The first one is diffusion and the second one is active transport. But when we talk about water, they move by one process which is known as osmosis. So whenever you ask that what are the processes or the movement processes for the molecules to move into and out of the cell, there are diffusion and active transport. Whereas for water, we have osmosis. For example, over here we have a salt molecule which can move by diffusion and active transport, whereas these water molecules move by osmosis. And the mechanism of diffusion and osmosis is the same, but it is different in case of the active transport, and we will study how is it actually different. We have cell membrane, which is and we have an intracellular space inside the cell membrane, and we have an extracellular space outside the cell. So cell membrane, the function is written over here. It regulates what comes in or out of the cell, one of the function of cell membrane. Another function of cell membrane we studied in cell structure was that it acts kind of a protecting layer outside the cells, and basically the main role is played by the cell wall in case of plant cells, but we have cell membrane present both inside the animal cells and plant cells. Hence, it also plays a role of protecting the cell, but mainly being partially permeable membrane, it actually regulates what comes into or out of the cell. We have these three processes over here. The first one is diffusion, secondly osmosis, and third one is for active transport. We talked about that for water, we have osmosis, whereas for all other molecules we have active transport and diffusion. So diffusion is also defined as the net overall movement of particles down a concentration gradient. Down a concentration gradient meaning from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. For example, the basic example we usually give to the student that if you do a perfume inside a room on one corner of the room, it will gradually spread in a short amount of time to the other side of the room. So you have the point where you actually sprayed was containing a larger and higher concentration of the perfume or the fragrance the scent molecules. And after a time, you can smell it if you're on the other side of the room because the molecules after the perfume have gradually spread throughout the room through the process of diffusion. It also occurs as a result of random movement of particles. We do not need any kind of energy or we do not need any kind of a stimulus for the diffusion to take place. It is a random movement of particles that can happen at any time whenever there is a need for balancing the concentration gradient. Concentration in gradient is actually, you can say, gradient first of all is a measure, is a balance. Gradient we call a balance between two things, and that gradient must be balanced in order for the cell to work properly, in order for any damage to go to prevent any damage. So the concentration gradient, we can say, higher outside the cell, and if it's lower inside the cell, the water or the molecules will move inside the cells. When we talk about osmosis, it is also similar to diffusion, but the only difference between diffusion and osmosis is that here we talk about water potential, because in this case we have the transport of water happening into and out of the cell, whereas in case of diffusion, we talk about molecules such as enzymes, such as other we can say particles, hormones, stimulus, the receptor molecule recepted by the cell membrane or during the bulk transport. So osmosis is the net movement of water molecules down a concentration gradient from higher concentration to lower concentration, similar to diffusion, through a partially permeable membrane. Adding this line through a partially permeable membrane is always compulsory and it is needed by the examiner in your answer because you have to specify where this process actually taking place. It is taking place across the partially permeable membrane, which in this case we have cell membrane. As we discussed, cell wall is not partially permeable, it is fully permeable. It has no control over the substances entering inside or outside the cells. Then we have active transport. Active transport is also a method for the movement of molecules. So it's a net movement of molecules and substances against a concentration gradient. In diffusion, we studied that both of these processes, diffusion and osmosis, were actually down the concentration gradient, meaning from high to low. But now when we talk about active transport is actually against the concentration gradient, which means it will be from lower to higher concentration. For example, if I have a cell and I have a lower concentration of molecules outside the cells and a higher molecule concentration gradient inside the cell, through active transport, those molecules will move inside the cells from lower concentration to higher concentration. So it's the net movement of molecules and substances against a concentration gradient from lower concentration to higher concentration. This process requires energy. Down the concentration gradient, when we talk about diffusion and osmosis, both of these processes were actually occurring down the concentration gradient, and they were as a result of random movement, which means they do not need any stimulus or any energy to get them to go. But in case of active transport, when we're pushing the molecules to go towards the higher concentration, we need energy, and that energy we get from respiration, which will be detailed studied in chapter number 11 or 12 of respiration. As molecules will not naturally move lower to higher concentration, the molecules would not be moving naturally from lower to higher concentration. They need a stimulus. They need some energy to move from low to high. This is why it is called active transport. Anything known as active, we have two terms. One is active and one is passive. Passive means without energy, and in case of passive, we have two examples. We have diffusion and osmosis. But whenever the term active comes, we can say that active means by using energy. Active transport works by using carrier proteins. This would be detailed studied in A level that how active transport works by using carrier proteins. And these carrier proteins, if I have the cell over here, these carrier proteins are actually present in the cell membrane, which help the molecules enter the cell through active transport. So this is a basic diagram explaining the process of diffusion over here. These molecules are able to cross the cell membrane. Why? Because we have a higher concentration of molecules outside, inside the extracellular fluid. We have a cell actually, and this is the extracellular fluid, and this side is the intracellular. Extracellular, which means the outside, and intracellular, inside the cell. So we have a higher concentration outside and a lower concentration of molecules inside, and we have the cytoplasm of the cell over here. You can see this is the diagram of the cell membrane that has been magnified over here, and this cell membrane is made of lipid bilayer. We'll be studying in detail in higher levels too. And this process is done with time, like by time these molecules diffuse from higher concentration to lower concentration inside the cells. Another example we can see over here that we have a higher concentration of molecules because if you count the molecules, there are a lot, maybe 20 to 25 molecules over here. While we have only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 molecules over here, which means this is a region of higher concentration and this is a region of lower concentration. Hence, the diffusion always takes place from higher gradient to lower concentration gradient. Hence, the movement of the molecule will be from left to right, and the result would be a balanced concentration equilibrium, a balanced gradient on both sides of the membrane. Think of this as cell membrane. We have this dotted line as the cell membrane. And now, once the diffusion has actually taken place, the molecules have been balanced on both the sides through diffusion. Then the molecules move from higher to lower concentration. Now, after diffusion comes osmosis. Osmosis also takes place through a partially permeable membrane. Partially permeable meaning only letting some of the molecules pass through. When we talked about diffusion, it was similar to osmosis, but it was for molecules, food molecules or anything else, enzymes and other substances. But when we are talking about the movement of water molecules, they can take place only by osmosis. We have a partially permeable membrane over here. Small water molecules are able to pass through the membrane, and large solute molecules are unable to pass through the membrane. So if you see, these are the blue water molecules, and we have the big solute red molecules which are unable to pass through the membrane. And we have a higher concentration of water molecules outside, and we have a lower concentration of water molecules inside. Hence, the movement goes from outside to inside. It is a similar process to diffusion, but the only difference is, I repeat again, that in case of osmosis, we only talk about the movement of water. But when we talk about diffusion, it is about the movement of enzymes, hormones, substances, chemical substances, other byproducts of chemical reactions that take place in cytoplasm and large molecules. We have another example over here. These blue molecules actually represent the water, H2O, chemical term. And we have a higher water concentration on the left side, and we have a lower water concentration on the right side. So of course we know, as we just studied, the movement would always be from higher to lower. Hence this is the partially permeable membrane, and the movement will be from left to right. And after a while, these water molecules will be balanced on both the sides of the membrane. Now we have the third and most important process that takes place in our cells and our body. Most of our chemical reactions and transport actually depend on active transport. Even when we talk about plants, the transport of sucrose will be studied later on in transport in flowering plants. That is actually dependent on active transport too. So active transport also takes place across the cell membrane. And we know that active transport is for the movement of molecules. But the difference, how is it different from diffusion and osmosis? We have diffusion and osmosis which travel from higher to lower, but in case of active transport, the molecules move from lower to higher concentration. For example, we have a lower concentration outside the cell, alright, and we have a higher concentration inside the cells. Now we know that active transport always moves from lower to higher. So we have uh, lower outside the cell and higher inside the cells. Hence these yellow molecules you can see over here, they travel from lower to higher, meaning outside to the inside of the cells. Now, active transport can happen through two ways. One is through the membrane. This is the first way. And the second way is through the carrier molecules. So active transport, you have to remember, that is different from diffusion and osmosis. Diffusion and osmosis was through higher to lower, whereas active transport is lower to higher and requires a stimulus in the form of ATP or energy. ATP, known as adenosine triphosphate, is itself an energy containing compound and is broken down when active transport needs to occur. And active transport can be done in two ways, whether either it's done through the cell membrane, the partially permeable membrane, the semi-permeable membrane, or the other way is through these carrier molecules which are actually embedded inside the cell membrane. Here another diagram showing us diffusion, and we have a diagram showing us active transport. Now we know that diffusion always takes place from higher to lower, and active transport takes place from a lower concentration outside to a higher concentration. In this case, we can see that yes, the molecules are in a higher concentration outside and in a lower concentration inside. Hence, the direction of movement would be, as you can see, the pink arrow is from left to right. In case of active transport, there is a lower concentration outside the cells and there is a higher concentration inside the cells. Hence, we know that active transport happens to lower to higher concentration. We have lower outside, higher inside, and the movement of the pink arrow indicates the active transport taking place through the semi-permeable membrane, or we can say the carrier protein, which is actually embedded on the cell membrane. And this process is done by with the help of ATP, energy carrying molecule, and it is the energy compound carrying molecule that triphosphate. No need to remember the full form. We will be covering this in chapter number 11 or 12, known as respiration. Diffusion, known as the passive transport system. Diffusion and osmosis are both passive transport systems. Why? Because they do not require ATP. Whereas active transport requires ATP. ATP is actually compound the molecule containing the energy. For example, your batteries, they contain the energy. We can call those batteries ATP. This ATP is an energy storage molecules, and this is broken down into adenosine diphosphate and a phosphate molecule ADP plus P1 whenever the energy is required for the active transport to take place. Now we'll be discussing that what affects the rate of movement. Now we have different factors that can affect the rate of movement into and out of the cells. The first one is the surface area to volume ratio. The bigger a cell or structure is, the smaller its surface area to volume ratio is, slowing down the rate at which substances can move across its surface. Now, for example, if you see, we have a circular cell, and these yellow areas, these yellow arrows actually indicate that there is not much space for diffusion, while on the other side, the second cell actually has a lot of points of attack, we can say. The points to be acted on, the points of attack, the target points, we have a lot of them. We can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 target points. And why is that? Because it is having more surface area. You have studied surface area in mathematics. The larger the surface area, the more is it exposed. The word exposed is actually combined with the effect of surface area. More the surface area, more is the cell membrane exposed. And more if it is exposed, there will be more diffusion. Hence, the diffusion increases as the surface area of the cell increases. Many cells which are adapted for diffusion have increased surface area in some way. For example, the root hair cells in plants. We studied that we have the root hair cells. They are a shape of like this. And they have an extended surface area from here to here. You can see they have extended a membranous system and membrane here that actually helps increasing the surface area. And when there is more surface area, more diffusion will take place, more water will be absorbed by the roots, and more diffusion will take place, more osmosis will take place, more mineral ions will be absorbed as the surface area is increased. The same is the case is with animals. This was the example of plants. In animals, we have villi molecules present in ileum, the small intestine, which absorb the products of digestion. They have a structure similar to root hair cells, something like this. And these are also some extensions that are actually adopted extensions or root hair type of cells extension that actually absorb the products of digestion. They absorb the useful products. We will be studying this in detail in the human nutrition chapter number 6 or 7, I guess. The larger surface area of a root hair cell, you see this is a large surface area. We have so many points of attack where the osmosis can occur. Whereas if I have a normal animal cell and on one side I have a root hair cell, of course this one is having more surface area than a normal typical plant cell. We have a cell membrane, cell wall. This membrane is actually responsible for the osmosis, and that osmosis is a passive transport. As I told you, there is a higher concentration of molecules outside the root hair cells in the soil and a lower concentration of water inside. Hence, the water moves inside the root hair cells from the surrounding soil through osmosis and diffusion. Hence, larger the surface area, more will be the osmosis and diffusion. The same example for animals we have. The previous one was for plants. In animals, we have lumen of intestine, glucose enters by active transport, and these extension, if you can see, they provide a larger surface area. S dot A is surface area. Larger surface area, more would be diffusion. More useful absorption of those useful substances will be carried out by the villi. Then we have another factor that affects the movement of substances, which is the distance. The smaller the distance molecules have to travel, the faster the transport will occur. For example, if I have a point A and I have a point B, do not look at the diagram. I have a point A and point B. I have a larger distance and hence the transport would take a long time. But if I have a shorter distance, basic idea, and I need to travel, it would take me lesser time. Hence, the smaller the distance molecules have to travel, the faster the transport will occur. Hence, if we have a thin membrane, for example, and I have a thick membrane on one side, of course, the thinner the membrane, the faster will the diffusion take place. The thicker the membrane, slower would be the diffusion. Of course, when I have a thin wall and I have a thick wall of membrane, the diffusion might be slower. But if I have a thin membrane, the diffusion will be faster. Short distance, faster diffusion. Long distance, slower diffusion. This is why, for example, the blood capillaries and alveoli present inside the lungs have walls which are only 1 cell thick, ensuring the rate of diffusion across them is fast as possible. So we have capillaries, and if we look at the cross-sectional view of a capillary, their walls are actually so thin that the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide can take place efficiently and faster as it can be because we have constant breathing and respiration taking place, hence we need a faster diffusion so our lungs can stay healthy and prevent any further damage to the lungs or alveoli. Then we have another factor which is temperature. So this is the third factor. The first one was the surface area. More the surface area, more the diffusion. The second one was the distance. Lesser the distance, faster would be the diffusion. The next factor we have is the temperature. The higher the temperature, the faster would the molecules move as they have more energy. In physics, we actually study a one theory known as the kinetic particle theory, in which whenever the temperature is increased, the molecules gain kinetic energy, they collide, they become faster, they gain momentum, and yes, they move faster. And hence, when they move faster, there will be more faster rate of them passing across the membrane. So, as we increase the temperature, the diffusion would also increase. Why? Because when the temperature increases, whenever you're asked that how this temperature affects the rate of diffusion, what you will write is as we increase the temperature, the speed and kinetic energy of the molecules increase. They move faster across the membranes and hence faster diffusion takes place from higher concentration to lower concentration. So low movement, we have low temperature, and high movement, high temperature. This results in more collisions against the cell membrane and therefore a faster rate of movement across them. Then we have another example, another fourth factor, which is concentration gradient. The greater the difference in concentration either side of the membrane, the faster movement across it will occur. For example, over here I have a concentration gradient of 10 and over here I have a concentration gradient of 0. In order to have an equal equilibrium of 5 on each side, it would take a lesser time and there will be a faster rate of diffusion. Why? Because all these black molecules you see will move in a lesser time fastly to higher concentration to a lower concentration. But in case of a shallow concentration gradient or a lower concentration gradient, over here if I have, for example, 8 concentration gradient and 4 over here, in order to equalize them to 6, 6, it would take more time and there would be a slower rate of diffusion. Because the black molecules over here you can see are actually already a bit of a divided. There is not too much difference on both the sides of the membrane. They are not completely separated, and hence steeper the concentration gradient, faster will be the rate of diffusion. This is because on the side with the higher concentration gradient, for example this side, more random collision against the membrane will occur. As you can see, the molecules which have to be transported on the right side are present more in number on the left side in a steeper concentration gradient, hence more the collision against the membrane will occur, faster will be the rate of diffusion. So over here if we have a concentration gradient, steeper the concentration gradient, like more the concentration gradient, faster will be the rate of diffusion. This is a summary of the factors affecting the rate of diffusion. Temperature means higher temperature, faster diffusion, larger surface area, faster diffusion, higher gradient, faster diffusion. This is another factor that is not included in the syllabus, but you should know that smaller the particles, the faster will be the diffusion. Why? Because if we have small particles versus large particles, these would pass, actually, they would be easily pass through the cell membrane, whereas the large particles might not fit in the holes inside the partially permeable membrane and may not be transported. Hence, smaller the particles, faster will be the rate of diffusion.